such a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. And of course, thank you to the Creative Mornings Toronto team for the invitation and for everyone who's on this Zoom thing this morning and willing to learn a little bit more about FoodShare, our work, and how we're, challenging traditional notions of charity. So I really look forward to sharing with you today. For those of you that aren't familiar with FoodShare, I'm going to, in a very unbiased way, tell you that we are the best charity on the planet. So when you make your donation checks out, please make sure FoodShare is one word. Sometimes people separate them. So make sure that's correct on your donation checks. Okay, thank you. Have a great day. I'm just kidding. I've got a few more things to share. I think one of the things that excites me about FoodShare the most is how the organization continues to turn elements of the traditional charity paradigm on its head. It's actually quite a lot of fun. But before maybe I talk about some of those pieces, I'd love to first look at how food charity usually functions in our society. So obviously, we all know that there are those with resources. There are those that have the resources that they need to stay alive. And then there are those with far more than they'll ever need. And then there are those that are made. We have designed systems that cause people to struggle to access the things that they need to stay alive. And I think what happens as a result of that is we all feel this, a moral imperative to do something to help those that are struggling to access something as essential as food. And I think that's the dilemma that, folks across the country, across the globe are in when we have this type of inequity. So what's happened in Canada is that, as many of you know, our default response to food insecurity is based on a model that's focused on the collection and distribution of other people's leftovers. But it's not just other people's leftovers, because of course, charity also sees to it that corporate waste is bestowed upon those that are materially poor. So we have this really weird situation in this country where, there are lots of commercials. Many of us talk to our friends about our favorite farmers markets and the local produce that we love, our relationship with the growers. While those that are materially poor in this country, what we do instead is we serve them a heaping pile of day-old Starbucks muffins, ladles of high sodium soup, bags of stale Cobb's bread, Oreo cookies, and pasta upon pasta noodles upon pasta noodles. So this corporate waste is what ends up happening is given to food banks. And the food banks in turn provide a halo and a handy photo op to the corporations that are donating that excess waste. Instead of the corporations actually paying the costs associated with, what they're doing, they're creating something, they're overproducing. Sometimes they're donating to food banks and food charities because the products are mislabeled or unsellable for some one reason or another. So instead, what we've created in this country is for these corporations, large food corporations that might overproduce or mislabel or have products that are unsellable, we have a handy cost savings loophole. That corporation calls up their local food bank. The food bank comes, takes it away at no cost to the corporation. Then what we do, it gets even stranger. Then the food bank deploys volunteers who sort through the donations. And then the food bank is forced to pay the costs associated with dumping the items that they can't distribute. So this has been happening since the 1980s. The first food bank in this country actually opened in 1981. The problem is the number of people that are food insecure since 1981 has just continued to increase. So Canada's approach, while making some of us feel better, clearly isn't solving this problem. And I know some of what I've said might be uncomfortable for some of us. Some of us have volunteered at food banks. Some of us donate to food banks. Some of us love food banks. And like I said, I understand that because it really comes from a moral imperative to feed our hungry neighbor, make sure our community has what they need. But unfortunately, what we've positioned as a solution to food insecurity and poverty in this country isn't actually working. What we rarely talk about in this country is the fact that actually we all have a right to food. So in 1976, the Canadian government ratified this international covenant which means that the government has a duty to ensure that we all have access to the food that we need so that we can feed our families, our communities now and into the future. Instead, we have politicians who happily pose for photos as they sort tins at food banks and then go one step further by encouraging their constituents to volunteer. And I remember the day that it hit me, how absurd this was. I was actually, the Governor General, former Governor General, had a bunch of Canadians helping inform the creation of a new charity. And the Governor General stood up. There were 24 of us that they flew to Ottawa, and the Governor General said it's going to be all about encouraging Canadians to volunteer. And I thought to myself, well, why are we encouraging people to volunteer? If politicians did what they were paid to, or better yet, what they promised to do in 1976 when they cemented our right to food, Canadians wouldn't have to be volunteering. We wouldn't have volunteers sorting through tins of food that is often expired or what have you. So I think this is a really important moment for us. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is food charity, coming from someone that works at a food charity, I know this is pretty wild, but is this the best and most helpful way to support folks who are food insecure? If it's clearly not reducing food insecurity levels, is this what we want to be doing moving forward? I think these are really big questions that we need to be asking ourselves and most certainly our elected officials. The Creative Mornings theme for this month is spectrum. So I think it's provided the inspiration and some of the framing for the rest of what I'm going to share today. When I think about spectrum, I think about difference. You know, when it's applied to people, I think not just about how a diverse population shares space, but how we play together in this country, how we learn together, how we live together. Unfortunately, you know, the more time I spend on this planet, in this country, I recognize that spectrum is not as it seems. It's a bit lopsided. There's one element of that spectrum that dominates all of the rest, and it's whiteness. When we look at the leaders of Canada's food charities, in fact, most charities, they are predominantly white. And as such, they're prone to something called white universalism, which means that the ideas presented by these leaders, who are white folks, more often than not white folks, are assumed to work for the entire spectrum of people that occupy this land, the entire spectrum of people that navigate food insecurity. But, you know, again, I work in food, and I think it goes way beyond leadership at these organizations. It's pretty atypical that me as a Black man is leading one of Canada's largest food organizations. But I think this issue of this kind of, you know, white supremacy dominates our entire food system. In fact, our food system is built on white supremacy. When we think about how food is grown in this country, actually, let's just go back to how much of this started. You know, it starts with growing food on stolen land and using stolen labor to grow that food. So when we fast forward to now, we'll notice that white supremacy is just as insidious and pervasive as it was back then. We have, you know, white farm owners employing Black and brown migrant agricultural workers who are in essence shackled to a single employer with few labor protections and limited mobility. All this, despite the fact that their labor is what allows us to enjoy our much celebrated local produce. Rarely a part of the conversation. When we think about the images of farmers in this country, we don't think about often migrant agricultural workers. In fact, I lived in Vancouver for a few years, and I remember going to the farmers market in the West End, and you would walk down this closed street, and the people offering samples of produce or selling the produce were almost always white. And then there were these tents that kind of blocked, you know, kind of enclosed each booth. And behind those booths were the Black and brown folks who were packing and preparing the food, the local food, again, so often ignored. So I just want to reinforce that it's not just old MacDonald and his straw hat out on the farm with his dog picking our carrots. You know, there is a lot of work and labor that goes into our local food that we often don't discuss. In fact, You know, we say that local food is, we have this idea, I think sometimes, that local food is inherently more just because we're not shipping it thousands of miles, but we have to remember we're shipping people thousands of miles to harvest this produce, and we're treating them quite poorly. So I think that's something that we've got to be talking about more. And why does this happen? I link this to white supremacy. So my sense is we need to disrupt all of this bullshit right now. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that something fundamentally different is possible, and that something fundamentally different is within reach. So to get there, we have to commit to dismantling the oppressive and insidious systems that continue to allow white folks to thrive at the expense of folks that look like me and at the expense of our planet. Going back to food share, another thing I love about our work is that we work towards ensuring the folks who have been systematically made more vulnerable as a result of these oppressive systems actually occupy leadership in the solution finding spaces. So food share's approach is unlike food banks. We don't have lovely folks from another community coming in and handing over leftovers and corporate waste. Our approach is actually to work alongside folks in communities across the city of Toronto to build community-led infrastructure. Community-led food infrastructure. So we're working together with communities to develop things like subsidized produce markets, urban farms, school meal programs, community compost exchanges. We even support groups looking to develop community gardens or any community-led food initiatives that make sense for us to support. But it's about what do folks in the community want to do and how can we support them? How can we leverage our resources and our experience to support leaders in local communities that are also struggling with access to food? We also prioritize projects and initiatives when it comes to the kind of support that we provide to BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as these are folks who have been excluded from leading the kind of solution finding for far too long. While we do this work, of building this community food infrastructure and farms and things like that with local communities, we recognize that we couldn't sleep at night if we pretended or if we positioned our work as a solution to food insecurity or poverty, which I'll be quite frank, happens with charities. We position often our work as solutions to really wicked problems, just so that we can get more donations. But ultimately, we're doing a disservice to the folks who show up at our doors every day or who work alongside us on these projects every day. So we don't do that. Instead, Food Share boldly acknowledges that we can't solve these issues alone and that charity should never be expected to. So we loudly advocate for the pieces that are missing to this puzzle, and they are things like effective public policy and political leadership that's focused on tackling poverty and food insecurity once and for all. I'll give you an example. And this is not the way that you might expect a food organization to show up for the communities it works alongside. So when the provincial government in Ontario was elected and, in my view, went to war on low-income workers, Food Share stood up. So as Doug Ford announced the rolling back of the planned increase of minimum wage, as many of us know, was set to go to $15. We wrote an open letter to the Premier and also urging him to not roll back the planned increase to minimum wage and publicly challenged him to live on the $14 an hour that he was proposing for low-income Ontarians for the remainder of his term. You can probably assume what happened. He did not do that. But I think it got lots of folks, particularly in the community food security space, having conversations about what it means to be in allegiance with low-income folks that are food insecure and living in poverty. And part of the reason we did that and why it was so important for us and a part of our work is we know that 60% of folks in this country that are food insecure actually derive their income from paid work, which means increasing minimum wage would have a far more significant impact on decreasing food insecurity and poverty in this province than a mountain of day-old Starbucks products ever could, or a ton of misshapen carrots and apples would also. So we realized also in our work that so much about food insecurity is misunderstood in this country, and it's affected actually quite profoundly the way we respond to food insecurity. If I can leave you with one thing that I really want you to take away from everything that I say today, it's that there are almost 5.5 million people that are food insecure in Canada. That means people that don't have enough food to eat. These are folks that are worried about where their next meals are going to come from. This is a massive crisis in Canada. The number of people that's food insecure is larger than the populations of the cities of Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg combined. Just to understand the gravitas of this situation. And we've seen what can happen. The context of the pandemic has really shown us what can happen when governments believe that there is truly an emergency or a crisis that we need to address. Why have we not addressed the issue of food insecurity and poverty in this country? That 5.5 million is higher than it's ever been in the history of those numbers being tracked. My hope is that by now you realize we won't solve the crisis by doing the same thing that has been done for the past 4 decades. And we realized that we needed to learn more about food insecurity. We needed to understand what was happening because we felt that the conversation and our collective understanding as a country around this issue was really quite lacking and a bit insufficient. So we partnered with a group out of the University of Toronto called PROOF, a food insecurity research group, to better understand food insecurity and its impact on Black Canadians specifically. Here's what we found in our research. But first, I think it's really important for me to let you know that this research that we did was the first time research like this had ever been done in this country. And I think that in and of itself was a problem, and you'll learn why in a moment. First, couple of things we learned. If you're Black in Canada, you're 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than if you're white. 12% of white children live in food insecure households, while 36% of Black children live in food insecure households. If that isn't appalling enough, what we learned next really shook much of what we understood about food insecurity in this country. For example, when we know aggregately, so when we look at the numbers aggregately, all of the people that are food insecure in this country, irrespective of race, we see a few things. So if someone is living in a single parent household, they are more likely to be food insecure. Except in this research, we found that for Black Canadians, didn't matter. Whether or not it was a single parent household, dual parent household, the prevalence remained high. Home ownership was another startling piece for us. When we look at home, when you own a home in Canada, or in most places, I would imagine, you're typically less likely to be food insecure. So it's one of those things that we see a relationship there. Again, aggregately, when we look at the situation for Black Canadians in this country, Black homeowners, about 14% of Black homeowners are food insecure, which is equal to the percentage of white renters in Canada, about 14% as well, that are also food insecure. Things like, one other thing I'll share that really jumped out at us was social assistance rates. We looked at, of course, where people got their money from that were food insecure. We know the bulk of folks are working, but there is a portion that are on social assistance. We actually found that white folks in Canada receive more on social assistance than Black folks do. And we couldn't understand why. We thought, aren't these just numbers you punch in and then a number comes out and it's pretty colorblind? Actually, we realized afterwards that, of course, social assistance rates includes disability income. So what we were led to believe is that white folks in this country are more likely to be approved for disability, and which means higher income than folks who are on welfare. And when they are approved for disability, they're approved for more. So for us, you might ask yourselves, why is all of this happening? What's causing Black folks to be 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white folks? It's very simple. These are clear examples of how anti-Black racism affects who has food to eat and who doesn't in this country. So to truly tackle an issue like food insecurity in this country, we have to reassert the spectrum. This idea that diversity is our strength, the model for the city of Toronto needs to be more than a model. We have to be willing to stand up against things like anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, and white supremacy if we're going to tackle the major issues before us. And it doesn't end with food and poverty. It's also climate change and housing, because these are so deeply embedded in our system. To be Black or Indigenous on this land shouldn't sentence someone to a life of constant struggle, especially when that struggle is against politicians that don't see us, institutions that don't listen to us, and systems that don't serve us. So I'll end with, I'm an optimist despite some of the unpleasant things I've shared. And I do truly believe that so much better is possible, including how we respond to the deep inequities in our society. Poverty and food insecurity are absolutely not inevitable. We could end them tomorrow, and I think we do. We need to put them where they belong once and for all, and that's in our history books. That's the work that we're committed to at FoodShare, and we truly hope that all of you will join us as well. Thank you so much.
How about a round of applause for Paul? Silent applause. Paul, I'm not sure if you can see in grid view yet, but there's a lot of people doing this right now.
Oh, wow. Look at all the people doing that. I can totally see grid view now. Wow. Hello, everybody. I'm going to join
And
you.
of course,
Even a baby.
For anyone that doesn't have their camera on, you can also just write clapping in the chat. That is also acceptable in our virtual world. Paul, thank you very much for that great chat. And we had a bunch of really interesting questions that I'd like to throw out to you now, just to get your opinions.
I'll try my best.
Oh, of course. I think you'll like these ones, and I think you're very, very well aligned to answering them. The most popular question by far, because literally people just wrote +1 with the question, was, what are your thoughts on a universal basic income, its practicality, and its impact on food insecurity?
Great question. I'm going to share one thing first that I didn't tell you about our research. The first thing I'll say is, and maybe I'll take a step back. Many of us in this country who work in food have been saying, we don't need another basic income pilot like we had in Ontario, because we actually have a basic income in this country. If you're a senior, as soon as you hit retirement age, seniors are actually the least food insecure aggregately in this country. We see levels of food insecurity drop, and that's because they have access to things like the guaranteed income supplement, old age security, their retirement income that they may have saved. So great. So many of us in this space have been advocating for basic income. This research changed things for us. When we looked specifically at Black seniors, the same wasn't true. The risk remained high regardless of a Black person becoming a senior. So that has gotten me thinking about basic income in a different kind of way. The first thing I think is, I'm not a fan of zoning in on a policy without a foundation. So for me, it's about taking a big step back and saying, okay, we live in one of the richest countries in the world. We all deserve to have a decent quality of life. What are all of the tools available to us to advance a decent quality of life for everyone? Of which an income floor or a basic income or a minimum income or whatever you want to call it, potentially is one of those tools, but it can't happen in isolation of a framework. So, and I think, yeah, basic income would be one, but I also think we have to look at a guarantee of services. We need affordable housing, we need childcare, we need affordable transit, and all of those things have to come together, because if we focus in on basic income, we might not be investing in childcare, we might not be investing in transit, so people's costs will go up. The last thing I'll say about basic income, it's a reminder for me of who's around the table advocating for interventions, because basic income is a go-forward approach. And it's a privilege to have a go-forward approach. The privilege of not having lived generations of lost wealth, lost opportunity, and the like, which many Black and Indigenous folks have had to endure in this country. So I think in addition to basic income and a guarantee of services, we also need to talk about restitution in the way of things like reparations. I'm thinking on basic income.
Well, Paul, I want to actually do a little follow-up to one of the things you just said. In my life, I've managed to visit several Indigenous reserves and several rural areas that also have a big problems with food insecurity. When you think of big cities and, like, for example, the downtown east side of Vancouver as places that have like serious issues, what has FoodShare done, or what can we speak on towards the food insecurity in rural areas and, for example, in Indigenous reserves, where there are places in this world that my family in Vancouver who lives in Kerrisdale do not believe, where there's not running water and electricity in the province. Do you know what I mean? So could you speak about food insecurity in rural areas?
I can't too much because I've never lived in a rural area, and Food Share's work that is focused on the city of Toronto,
Okay.
except when it comes to some of the Indigenous support work that we're doing, that we kind of ignore the boundary that is Toronto. But what I can say is, it is an issue that's largely ignored in this country. I think about the release of the most recent food guide, Canada's new food guide, that so many people in the space that I work were so excited, so pleased. The food guide said things like, eat more plant-based food, drink water instead of sugary soft drinks, which is wonderful. But it's like telling people, many folks in Indigenous communities, rural Indigenous communities, it's like telling them to drive a car that doesn't have a seatbelt. How insulting is it when you think about it, that our federal government is introducing something and saying to folks, drink more water, it's better for you, but yet we still have boil water advisory on over 50 remote and Indigenous northern communities. So I just think so much of this is tied to anti-indigeneity and an unwillingness to actually embrace a human rights framework that allows Indigenous folks to recognize Indigenous food sovereignty and Indigenous land and title rights. The fact that Indigenous communities, not too far from where I am right now, are being faced with injunctions by our provincial government to be able to hold on to their land, to me is appalling. And it's clear examples of anti-indigeneity that we all need to be speaking up against.
And Paul, your passion comes across when you speak. I think a lot of people respond to that. And that actually brings us to the next question. And this is something that I would really love to know. One of the things that people really enjoy and appreciate about when you speak is that you seem to be very uncensored, and you're not afraid to be critical of political infrastructure and cultural infrastructure. One person wrote and asked us, do you ever worry as a charity that you will alienate potential government support, potential sponsors? And what would you advise to other charities who are nervous about speaking out because they're afraid of losing their support?
Don't speak. You don't want that support. If it comes with strings, if it's going to prevent you from standing up and working alongside the communities that we have an allegiance to, that's the support that I'm concerned about losing. That's the support that I really want to work hard to maintain and continue to foster relationships with. Because if a funder is going to walk away, if a government, and sorry, I should say, these are not just lofty words. We have had funders come to us with offers of $250,000. We've had funders come to us with significant offers, and we've said no, either because their approach is not in line with our food justice approach, is not in line with our racial justice approach, is not in line with our body positivity approach. We work in food. So often folks will reach out to us and want to start these programs around getting people to lose weight. We're not interested in getting people to lose weight. We just want people to have access to the food that they need. So we're never afraid to say no. And I think the folks that need to be supporting your work, who want to support your work, will show up. We have, we publicly called for defunding the police and connected it to food insecurity. We had some of our donors say, okay, we're not supporting Food Share anymore. And we said, we understand. Thank you so much. It's been a net benefit because we've actually had more people who say, I want to support an organization that is willing to do what needs to be done and say what needs to be said to actually work on addressing the issues that we care about. So I just encourage people, and this is true in all of our workplaces and all of our friend groups. There's so many, these kinds of assumptions often are so insidious in the way in which they influence what we feel we can say and can't say and share and can't share. So I just encourage people to just try really hard to push back against those parameters.
And have you had pushback in certain situations from, let's say, either from a political level or from at a corporate level? Have you ever experienced any of that?
Definitely. I've had, I'm having I'm having lunch with after this. I'm having lunch with one of our donors. We're working on a racial justice. Actually, I'll give you how much of this can I share? Let me think about
You know what? Don't even worry. It's okay. I don't want to get you in trouble.
No, I don't mind, but I won't share the company.
Watch,
But
Paul will be like, it's all CMT's fault. That's it. I lost it. That's it.
A large food company in this country has been giving us some funding for the last several years. They invited me to come and do a keynote to share ideas on food insecurity in this country. And of course, I shared things like I shared today, and invited folks into a conversation around anti-Black racism. But I also see it as an opportunity to build relationships. This idea that you can't bite the hand that feeds you, to me, is ridiculous. First of all, I feed me, and other folks just donate to the organization that I work at. So we're in partnership. So I say to them, we're committed to increasing. So we just did this thing last year or the year before, where we introduced a new pay grid, gave folks at the bottom of the pay grid a 25% increase, folks at the top of the pay grid, no increase. And I said to the CEO very publicly at this event, I said, so we are committed to supporting our low-wage workers, and we figure that you have so much more experience in this since you have such a large workforce. What ideas do you have for us? So it is really about, these relationships that we get into with funders or governments. They're just relationships. It's like you're dating. And if you don't share what you feel or what's important to you, the relationship's not going to work out. So we like our relationships to work out. And if they don't, we say, oh, wow, it didn't work out.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so I want to throw one more question to you. I'm dying to follow up with something, but there's another really interesting question. It's just going to switch the conversation for a second. Someone made a reference to, you had mentioned in a previous interview that you think it would be such a great idea if we could take all these golf courses and make them into arable land that we could use. I will take it one step further and say front lawns. And I was wondering if you could speak to that idea, and specifically, how can we convince individuals, societal classes, that it might be a good thing to build one less golf course, or maybe just making nice green grass is not the best use for that soil? How can we start that process of convincing people, and what would that do if we did?
It's a good question. Every time I talk about golfing, golf courses, I get the golfing lobby emails me a lot. I get lots of invitations to go golfing.
They do not, really?
Yes, old white men, golfers, Hall of Famers. I get lots of emails. Yeah. I've never been golfing in my life. But I think, part of the reason I said that is I think there's two things. One, I think it's important for us to be creative and to think outside of the box. So we have these 5 golf courses that are owned by the city of Toronto that are losing money and providing no benefit to the communities around them. And we're watering all of that lawn, and yet we're struggling for spaces for people to get together outside and physically distance. Where food insecurity has been one of the largest issues during this pandemic, but yet the city is about to approve renewing a lease, an agreement that allows a company to operate these golf courses. So FoodShare and a few other organizations said, wait a minute, is this really what we should be doing? So of course, there's a subcommittee of council that looked at this, and they approved the next step in renewing these leases or extending these leases for 2 years. But on September 30th, it goes to city council for a decision. Oh. And I think each of us, so if you're not following FoodShare on Instagram or social media, please do.
Let's get that handle again in the chat so everyone does it right now.
Awesome. And if you follow me, I'll be posting about it as well. But we're going to encourage people to get in touch with our local city councilors and say, actually, we want to see the public good served through these public spaces. And I'll just, tying it back to what I was saying earlier, the thing that I find so boggling about holding on to these golf courses is golf is a sport that's disproportionately played and enjoyed by wealthy, older white men. So we're asking a predominantly white council, predominantly white men, to then, so just the fact that, that's been the situation, that to me tells me why we've held on to these golf courses and why we continue to subsidize them. So actually committing to challenging things like patriarchy and white supremacy means that it's not just a hashtag, it's not just a march, it's about where are the opportunities to challenge that in our communities, in our city. And I think challenging subsidizing golf courses is a great place to do some of that work.
I love it. And we're going to leave it just there. We have like 1 more minute, and I have two more things for you, Paul, if that's all right.
No problem.
Number one, just very quick, you mentioned someone was very impacted by some of the stats you gave out in terms of the food insecurity. 60% of people who work are also food insecure. Where can people find these stats so that they can use them and share them?
Good question. I've cobbled some of these together based on my research. But if you look at FoodShare's website, which is not the greatest, it needs some love. It's been on my list. Well,
you are speaking to many a graphic designer and web designer right now, people. So make sure to reach out to Paul.
Is there a virtual nudge? No, okay. But in any event, our website, on our website, we have an infographic that speaks to all of the research that we did with proof. Actually, maybe I'll give you better advice. Instead of trying to find it on our website, Google it, FoodShare proof, Black food insecurity, and you'll find the research.
And you already have one offer from Colin Smith, one of our illustrious volunteers. He said, content designer ready to help. Print designer here, happy to volunteer. That's D. And then Tammy Rogers, graphic designer, happy to help. So I'll ask all of you to please reach out, either through Instagram or Twitter. All the links are there, and you guys can continue the conversation. And speaking of conversations, one of the things we like to do here at Creative Mornings is have breakout rooms. Usually we do them as fun networking events. But Paul, your final challenge for today, sir. Okay. In a moment, everyone is going to go into a breakout room, and I would love for you to give them a topic. They're going to have about 1 or 2 minutes in groups of 3 or 4. What should they do? What should they talk about?
Great. So I can throw a couple questions out there. What can you do in your spaces of influence to either challenge patriarchy, white supremacy, or what can you be doing to help tackle poverty or food insecurity within the spaces of influence that you navigate?
All right. So Dorothy, it's time for the breakout rooms. We'll be having the pitches right afterward. One more time.
Hey, Ivan. Sorry. No, I just wanted to wrap up and thank Paul before we go into the breakout room. Thank you so much, Paul, for educating us on this so important topic and dedicating your life to it, because please go ahead and visit Paul's website and read about his story and all the things that he has been doing. And it's so great to learn about it. And actually, we want to know, what can we do today? So we're going to be following you and all the work that you do and supporting you. Thank you so much for your time.
My absolute pleasure. I just want to end with, like I said, better is possible. So let's get on with making the possible possible. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you having me here today.